Okay, we're starting to admit some additional people as they come in, but for now I wanted to welcome you all to this session. We have a couple of great presenters that will be sharing their information with you, but a couple of housekeeping things I wanted to touch on real quick is that we have two people presenting. They're going to present their information and they've allowed time afterwards for questions. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that we get them covered. And then it should last about an hour. Our session is planned for. You will be asked to complete two surveys, one for the overall experience of the conference, and then for this particular session. And I'll put that survey in the chat at the end. So please make sure you copy it and paste it so you have it available to you after the session is over. Let's see, please mute yourself if you're not speaking or being asked or asking a question. I wanted to go to the next slide. And just real quick, talk about the acknowledgement of land. There is a couple of different versions here. We have Arizona State University, Northern Arizona University, and the University of Arizona, all acknowledging in slightly different ways that we occupy land and territories of indigenous peoples. We've shared each institution's land acknowledgement on this slide for your education and awareness. With that, I want to introduce our two presenters. Let me get that information up real quick. Sorry about that. I have a couple of windows open and they're blocking the other one. So, whoops. All right. Sorry. Again, sorry for the. Here it is. All right. All right, since I can't find it, I'm going to let Sam and Sarah go ahead and introduce themselves while I met a couple of other people. I apologize for not having that information available to share, but Sarah, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. I'm Sarah Kern. I'm the Assistant Director of our Fiscal Oversight group here at Arizona State University. We're a central research operations department. We have many functions that roll up to us, but one of them is the audit response function for sponsored projects. So I'm the official external audit liaison for ASU for any sponsored projects. I've been working in research administration ever since 2008. I love it. It's my career. So I'm really excited to talk with all of you about audits today. And then this is my colleague, Sam Munguia. She and I have worked several years together in different capacities. Sam, if you could give everyone an update of who you are.
Hello, I am Sam Munguia. I'm an Assistant Director of Research Advancement for ASU's Carey School of Business. I am a Fiscal Oversight alum. I worked under Sarah, and I overall am an audit readiness enthusiast. And I have been doing research administration for about 18 years, and I actually started in grants doing the receiving end of a lot of external audits. And then I think I'm gonna go first. So can we advance the slide, please? Okay, perfect. And we did that. So before we get started, just like a super quick high level overview, anything that ever posts to a sponsored project should be compliant with the determinants of allowability. There is because we do want these slides to be a resource for later use, I did include all the language that's included in uniform guidance as it talks about allowability. But major things to remember about allowability is that things need to be reasonable and necessary for the performance of the project. They need to conform to limitation. That means that it should be allowable based on applicable policies from the sponsor, federal government, your institution, for us, state of Arizona. Also, things should be treatedly consistently. So making sure that we are treating things the way your institution normally would process those expenses. Next slide, please. And then lastly, making sure, and this is a really important one, that things are documented. Everything that posts to a sponsored project should be adequately documented every single time. Next slide, please. So one thing that I also like to remind people as you are reviewing things for allowability is making sure that you remember the prudent person test. With somebody in the same position with the same knowledge that you have, make the same decision that you made at that time. And I also sometimes like to take it a little bit further, is, you know, thinking, would a person off the street, if I explain them what I did, would they agree with my decision-making process? Next slide, please. And so audit readiness is something that we talk about a lot in research administration. I feel that a lot of people kind of have a sense of what it is. And, you know, it's one of those concepts that people, you know, you'll know it when you see it. But I did find a couple of things that I wanted to share as it applies to audit readiness. But basically that the focus is, you know, making sure that your institution, including your department, have strong and mature internal controls and operating procedures that support strong research administration operations. Having those strong systems in place ensures that you'll have success in the event of an audit, whether it's an internal audit, external, planned, or unplanned. And one of the most important things about audit readiness, and I know here at ASU, you know, we try to make sure everybody is on board with this, is that documentation is key. Documentation should always speak for itself, and every single transaction should stand on its own without having to provide any additional explanations. And, you know, just a reminder that, you know, audits most of the time don't happen while the project is going on. It happens either after the project has ended or many years later. People leave, transition, and memories fade. The best gift you can give yourself, your future self, and your department is to make sure that that documentation is clearly documenting any decision-making process, any exceptions to policy, and overall making sure that it shows why things are allowable. Next slide, please. So one thing that I have done this because I did start in audits and I was audited a lot, is I like to review any available audit reports. One of my favorite sources for that is the NSF's Office of the Inspector General Performance Audit Reports, which are available at that website. Again, you will get conference materials after in the next couple of weeks. So if you've never been on this site, I highly recommend it. It does show, it allows you to get a better sense of what are some of the findings that are most common, or things that NSF is focusing on as they review our transactions. Next slide, please. So most of these reports will categorize audit findings into broad categories. So some of those main finding areas that they publish include things like inappropriately allocated expenses, unallowable expenses, non-compliance with institutional policy. And in a very non-scientific way, after my review of about 8 different reports in preparation for today's session, I did see that about 60% of findings fell into the inadequately supported expenses. Again, going back to that audit readiness, these are all transactions where the backup documentation was insufficient to show to an auditor why a particular expense was allowable. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through a couple of interesting findings that I thought would be helpful for discussion. After each finding, I'll provide some recommendations, not only based on, you know, my experience at the department level, but also in some of the recommendations made by the auditors themselves. The first one that I found was about a PI who charged 100% of publication costs. But the publication, the article itself, acknowledged over 9 different funding sources in the acknowledgement section. Next slide, please. So for this particular example, one thing to keep in mind and remind ourselves is about, you know, allocation methodologies. So in terms of what actions you can take at the department level, it includes, for example, if you do get a purchasing request for payment on a publication, maybe asking for a copy of that publication or just a screenshot of that acknowledgement section. If the acknowledgement section is talking about multiple grants, right off the bat, you know that we cannot easily justify, just charging one grant at 100%. So another thing that you could potentially implement is making changes to your purchasing request form and include a PI certification or a box where they acknowledge that they know, that it's only going to be benefiting one particular project. If you do need a refresher on allocation methodologies, we do have a great training available online called Allocation Methodologies, which was presented with Sarah Kern in conjunction with the U of A from 2 years ago. Again, link will be included in the slides. So another example that we have was for research pay to an associate professor, where there were inconsistencies with the person's rate of pay. It looked to the auditors that the compensation rate fluctuated based on the nature and type of the work performed. So some recommendations for this. One thing to keep in mind, and it has a huge, education component, is making sure that we are educating both our faculty and our research administration staff on the fact that grant funding cannot be used to temporarily inflate somebody's salary. People should always be paid at their institutional rate of pay. And a couple of things that you can do is, again, for as part of your education, sending reminders to faculty and staff at key moments throughout the execution of the project, like, the start of the project, start of the fiscal year, when people are getting ready to make summer pay plans. The other option that you can have to avoid this type of finding would be to institute a payroll verification form. So before you start mapping a person to a particular sponsor project, having a payroll verification process or form that includes, the person's rate of pay, effective date of that rate of pay, maximum compensation allowed, and have that form be certified either by a research administrator or by a human resources contact. And again, this will all become part of your, documentation in the event of an audit. Can we advance the slide just twice? One more. Yes. Okay, so this one was actually quite common in some of the reports that I found, was different projects purchasing gift cards that later ended up not actually benefiting the project. Next slide. And so for this one, what I think it's very important for people to remember is that there is a difference between planned benefit and actual benefit to the project. Gift cards are like petty cash. So at the time you purchase the gift cards, they are actually not giving any benefit to the project. They only benefit the project after those are disbursed. So if that gift card is never issued to anyone, it becomes unallowable if it's not used by the end of the period of performance. So some recommendations for this is that you could implement a verification of gift card usage towards the end of the project or at the department level award closeout. If you're not able to use those gift cards, making sure that we're either moving those off to a non-sponsored account or maybe moving them to a different project that can actually use them during the approved period of performance. We had a lot of those planned versus actual benefit issues with canceled travel during COVID. A lot of people ended up receiving travel credits for travel that never occurred. So if the travel never occurred, it never benefited the project, and therefore it becomes unallowable at the end of the project. Next slide, please. For this one, again, it's a little bit of the focus on planned versus actual benefit. For this particular finding, they had a group of travelers pay a refundable damage deposit. However, that refundable deposit was never documented to have been paid back to the grant. So next slide, please. And so, again, we need to make sure that for those refundable items, credits things of that nature, that things are actually benefiting the project. It actually has to have a purpose. Similar to the issue with gift cards, at the completion of travel, the department should verify that those temporary deposits are either, maybe they did cause some damage to the lodging location. So if that's the case, making sure we have the backup documentation. But in the event that those funds were not used, we want to make sure that they're either returned or that the expense is moved off to a non-sponsored account. And again, this is similar to travel credits. If those credits are not used, they are not benefiting the project. Next slide, please. And so for this one, I struggled because I agreed 100% with the auditors. So it was a purchase for Apple AirPods. The justification business purpose that they included for the purchase was that the AirPods were useful for listening to webinars, the knowledge of which was utilized in the NSF project. That was it. And so the NSF auditors found this purchase to not be prudent, necessary, allocable, or reasonable. Next slide, please. I had a duplicate slide. One more, please. So one thing why I kept that particular example is because it is important to be mindful about technology purchases. I am at the department level and have been on and off for like 10 years. So one thing that people get drawn to new technology, and especially Apple products. And so we need to do a good job in creating a culture with our faculty to create very strong justifications. It cannot just be because Apple products are pretty and effective. We need to show actual benefit to the project. So for the particular case of the AirPods, like maybe the person who approved the transaction needed to ask more questions. Is this for medical reasons? Has there been a recent change in workspace arrangements? There can be reasons for it. But one thing that was also included in the recommendations from the auditors for this example is that maybe, one thing that made it more unreasonable is the fact that it was 100% charged to this particular project. So if the PI was, doing regular department meetings and things like that are not 100% tied to the project, it makes no sense to charge 100% of that purchase on the award. So again, that allocation methodology becomes really important. Next slide, please. So for this one, it's actually not about a transaction, but rather compliance with terms and conditions of an award. There was a PI who had 2 delinquent final programmatic reports due to NSF, and they did not submit those reports until after NSF requested those reports as part of their audit. Next slide. So for this particular one, it is important to check in with faculty to make sure they are complying with programmatic reporting, as it is one of required deliverables. But make sure that you're able to establish a departmental process to check for programmatic reporting compliance. I know at ASU central office has previously provided how to do checks for NSF and NIH reporting. So if you are not sure how to do that, I would highly recommend checking with your central office, or just simply checking with your PI as part of your handoff process, or monthly periodic meetings, making sure that you're both offering support in case they need it, and showing reminders. I know that in previous departments that I worked for, the department head was always very supportive of enforcing some of that compliance when it comes to reporting. Next slide, please. So if you participated in our budgeting sessions on Tuesday, we talked about how participant support is a highly restricted category. In my 18 years of doing research administration, I have yet to see NSF willingly and explicitly approve a rebudget out of participant support. And so for this particular finding, they had a PI use almost $55,000 worth of participant support cost for non-participant expenses, and mostly to cover some faculty summer salaries, ERE, and FNA. Next slide, please. So for this one, training and using the correct language is a huge a huge, it's a recommendation. It's the best practice. We need to make sure that both the PI and the staff know when they need to request prior approval from a sponsor and what that process looks like. Also, we want to make sure that PI and RA staff actually know the definition of participant support. I know that working with faculty, they'll use participant support, human subject pay, stipend, and all of these words interchangeably, even though in compliance talk, they have very different meanings. So a good recommendation for this would be to update your purchasing forms to actually include a definition of participant support and include a certification checkbox to make sure that your PI, is confirming that the purchase meets that definition. Next slide, please. And so this one is really long to read, but you'll get the slides. But the gist of it is that the PI wanted to rebudget out of participant support. They, got email approval from a program officer, and turns out that the request was actually originally submitted through Fastlane, and the grants officer rejected it. Next slide, please. So for this, recommendations include making sure your PI and your research administration staff actually know who are the appropriate contacts at the sponsor. So for NSF, the program officer focuses on technical things related to the project, while your grants officer is the administrative compliance, permission person. So making sure that you are educating both your PI and your research administration staff, making sure that you're sending periodic reminders about what prior approval processes look like. Again, this could happen at the start of the project, at the start of a program year, and also making sure that we are including that official sponsor notification with transaction backup, especially for things that are major, as rebudgeting out of participant support. Next slide, please. And so for this one, that is probably the second most common audit finding is purchases received near or after the award expiration. And the key here is received. So for the longest time, people, used to base their decision on allowability based on when purchases were placed. And, it became a trend that, auditors came in and wanting to see shipping labels and, delivery notifications. They want to know when that purchase was actually in the hands of project personnel and actually available to benefit the project. Most of the most common things that we see purchased at the end, towards the end, or after the end of the project: computers and extending warranty and those audits and those iPads. So in this particular one, you can see that there was an Apple iPad and warranty purchased 7 days after the end of the project. So again, these are very, very, very common. Next slide, please. So overall recommendations for that type of issue is making sure that technology purchases happen very early on in the project. If they want them, they can have them year one. They don't need to wait until year 5 to get these purchases. I know some faculty like to hoard money and then try to plan for the future. But ultimately, we want the project to have all the resources they need at the right time. And also, I wanted to mention that I've been in research administration for a while, and it used to be best practice to do 90, 60, 30, where at 90 days you're planning what to do with your remaining funds. I highly recommend moving that timeline. It's like meet with your faculty on day 1 of the last year of the project and be like, hey, what do we still need to do? What do we need to purchase? Let's do it right now. And also, making technology becomes very appealing as a purchase towards the end of the project. So making sure that we're having those very, very strong justifications and that we are tying things directly to project deliverables, and that we're not saying things like, I needed to check my email and to write a paper. And again, all of these needs to be included in your justification. Next slide. And then just to wrap it up with common tribal findings, there's a lot of this happening in all of the reports that I saw. Most of the common findings we have are, PI traveling to a conference to present findings on a different award. So similar to the example we had about publications. Also, unallowable business class upgrades, university employee travel coded as participant support. And then I have a typo, but I meant to say charging travel cost when personnel were actually not in travel status. And this is an example from a university in the East Coast where they paid for PhD students to attend a conference. And while they took the flight and stayed in the hotel, they actually not showed up to the conference. They just took the trip. So if that is something that, you can avoid, some recommendations, next slide, please, could potentially be making sure that they're providing, I don't know, some sort of confirmation that they actually checked into the event. But overall, travel recommendations, which I apply to literally every single audit finding, include back to basics. Remember your determinants of allowability, making sure that you are, crossing all your T's, dotting all your I's, remembering that planned versus actual benefit. Another thing that happens a lot during travel is that a faculty member will be split funded across multiple projects, ends up taking a trip and wants to charge it to just one grant, making sure that, that salary during that travel time is actually matching, making sure that travel is happening during the period of performance. So they must return before the end of the project. And again, like similar to the issue with the publication, if they're giving a talk or a poster, making sure that those projects that are being acknowledged are being charged for that travel. And lastly, for Fly America exceptions are a huge finding. They're very common, making sure we're making those exception documentations at the time of travel and not a year later. And with all of that, I know it's a lot of information. I'll hand it over to Sarah.
All right, thanks so much, Sam. So I have the fun vantage point of being able to face both internally and externally for compliance. So for those of you at ASU, anytime you're needing to get a cost transfer exception, that you're probably talking to me. And so when I'm looking internally at transactions, I am trying to use them as teaching opportunities. And I go in trying to find, putting on an auditor hat and trying to find all of the weak spots. And so I know sometimes it can get annoying, my tenaciousness and being like, well, this looks a little suspicious, or this looks like, something is being spent down just to spend down a budget. And so it's interesting of that internally as part of our internal controls and education. The hat I wear externally when working with auditors is very different. That is I am there to help provide a confident defense for our really positive internal controls at the university, and to be there to support the departments who are being engaged in an audit. So it's a really fun being able to flip back and forth. Could you go to the next slide? So this is really intended, this part of the discussion, to talk about, all right, hopefully you've been doing everything that you should be doing that Sam just talked about. But whether or not you have, this is now the point where you have received some sort of audit request. And so we're going to talk through strategies that you can use out in the departments, and then also considerations if you are a central administrator of how can you move through an audit successfully. So one of the first things is to make sure that you've got a sense of what is the type of request. We actually don't get very many formal audits where we're getting a memo that clearly outlines we are auditing you. So one of our sponsors, we're auditing you, and here are the things that we're testing. That's actually pretty rare. More often we're seeing things that are more of like desk reviews. So that's where an external organization is doing some sampling, some monitoring activities. And so often they won't say audit. We still, in my team, we treat those at the level of an audit. Because a desk review, if not handled correctly, can very quickly trigger a formal audit. So, and then there's also considerations of, is this more of a programmatic audit, or is it a financial audit? And often they're both. So figuring out, is the person who's got the questions from the external, are they really focusing on our financial controls? Or are they really looking at the how the program itself is performing? And then finally, you want to be thinking about, is this a monitoring activity or an investigative activity? Because the way that you handle that in your communication is going to differ. So monitoring activity would just be, most of our, particularly federal agencies, have a requirement to do some percentage of sampling of individuals, of recipients of their awards. And so they're doing sampling, they're reaching out. This wasn't triggered because of something risky that they identified your particular institution as doing. However, on the investigative side, that's typically because they've been doing some sort of monitoring on their end and are saying this particular institution seems to be having issues with draws or with cash balances, or maybe a programmatic officer is noticing some sort of issue with the PI's technical reports, and so then they're coming in to do an audit. So the way that you handle that is going to be a little bit different as far as the seriousness and formality. So that's something that's helpful to be aware of. Now, when you get the communication, we tend to see much of the time the notices about an audit, desk review, some sort of programmatic review, those are usually going straight to department and PI staff. At ASU, we have our central team. I manage the team that helps to respond to all of these types of audit requests. And often we're the last ones to know. So if you're in the department or if you're in a different central team, you want to immediately, once you get notification, provide that to whoever your central audit manager is. The central audit manager then should be acknowledging receipt immediately to the sponsor of the request, and that so that they know that it's gotten into the right hands. As you're starting as an institution to respond to some sort of audit request, one of the things that's really important is to be requesting clarification from the auditor. So oftentimes they will ask questions or request certain types of documentation, and it's not really clear of maybe the period. Sometimes it's not clear of the award, or it's not clear of the depth of documentation that they're looking for. So any types of questions there should be going straight to the auditor. Ideally, this communication is all being handled by a central audit team member who's coordinating all of the activities. The other thing as well is that the auditors will typically provide you with a timeline to be responding. Just know that timelines are always negotiable. So if your team is getting just through a big proposal season, or it's end of semester, or you've even got someone on vacation, you're always allowed to negotiate timelines. My team does that all the time, and I don't think we've ever unsuccessfully negotiated a revised timeline to be able to get documentation. Next slide, please. So with these audit requests, there's generally a request for documentation. And so the central audit manager should be the one who's identifying who's going to pull all of those requested samples. So sometimes if they're sampling invoicing, that's going to be coming from that documentation is going to be coming from the central side, at least to ASU. In the departments, if it's for particular direct cost transactions, if that documentation is not readily available in the financial system, then we're typically reaching out to the departments to be able to provide that. The temptation can be, especially when you're working with a larger audit, is just to be relieved of, all right, we pulled together all of the documentation, now let's send it over to the auditor. You want to thoroughly vet to be able to have the best defense of your internal controls and to get ahead of any potential risks or findings that are going to happen through the audit. You want to make sure that you're reviewing all of the documentation that's about to be provided to the auditor as if you are the auditor themselves. So you're looking to see, were policies followed? Does the documentation that's provided clearly support the transaction sample? So if you can't understand the backup, your auditor is not going to be able to understand it either. So one of the big things that our central team works on is we want to reduce the amount of intellectual effort that the auditor has to do to complete our audit. The more confusing or the more mental load that they have in trying to review our materials, the higher likelihood that the audit is going to get dragged on. There's going to be more questions, or they're going to think if this documentation is confusing, maybe there's a not appropriate reason for why that is. So really looking at the documentation and seeing what you have. The other thing is it can be tempting that an auditor may say, hey, I need you to provide hourly logs of your faculty's time on your sponsored project. So auditors, they don't necessarily know what type of documentation is appropriate for you to provide, because documentation standards is not just based on uniform guidance or sponsor requirements, it's also based on your own institution's requirements. So when you look at an auditor's request, you should be really thinking not so much about what they're asking for, but more of what are they trying to test? Are they trying to test that there are appropriate approvals in place? Are they trying to test, if they ask for hourly logs, is it really that what they're trying to do is to verify that the time charged to the sponsored project is appropriate? And so if you don't do hourly logs, which we don't for our faculty, and uniform guidance has lots of support of why we don't do that, then you should be providing the documentation that helps support the auditor's verification process. Often, you will then have to provide some clear justification of why you're not providing them time logs. We just recently had to do this for a desk review, not an audit, but they were expecting hourly time logs from the PI, and it was a federal agency. And so we had to actually quote back uniform guidance and describe why we didn't do that and what all of our internal controls are that help to verify those expenses. So don't assume that your auditor knows everything about uniform guidance, or knows all of the appropriate ways to apply them. So the big thing when you're working in this audit space is to be confident in the internal controls that your group already has, and to be able to put those forward in the best light. The other thing is you should be resisting the urge to do new documentation. Sometimes we want to go overboard in trying to prove something to an auditor. So for me, I tend to be like, I can create a spreadsheet and I can do all of these things to prove something to them. But really, if our documentation is standing on its own, we shouldn't be having to produce a whole bunch of new materials. So really watch yourself for that. And if you are having to do that type of rework, then that's indicating potentially some sort of internal control gap or documentation gap at your organization. Next slide, please. Okay, so oftentimes auditors will want to meet now in pandemic, post-ish pandemic days. They're usually through Zoom calls, but your preparation is still going to be very much the same. You want to make sure anytime there's a meeting with an auditor, there's at least 2 university representatives on the call, a meeting. Generally, that's going to include someone from the unit representing the particular award that's being audited, and then it's going to include someone from your central office who's performing in that audit space. One of the biggest things you can do to just save yourself a lot of hassle is determine in advance who's going to be the lead speaker. Very often, me and at least 1 or 2 of my team members from central office are showing up. We don't want all 3 of us talking the entire meeting. So your lead speaker is generally who is the most experienced policy member of the group of people that are going to be meeting. Generally, it's going to be someone from central office, and they're responsible for providing initial responses and then for calling on the other attendees to the meeting to provide additional information. So that's something really important to do. In preparation, review the award statement of work. And then depending on the complexity, or if you're like, oh no, if you have the feeling of, oh no, the auditor chose this award, you definitely need to do a pre-audit meeting internally to talk about risks and strategies of how you're going to navigate that type of conversation with the auditor. Next slide, please. Okay, so during an audit meeting, The audit meeting should actually be the easiest part of this whole process if you follow just a few simple rules. So the first one is you want to be demonstrating confident engagement. So be making eye contact with the auditor or do your best through Zoom, right? Looking into the camera. Make sure you engage in some pleasantries. Auditors are real people too. And so that can go a long way for setting the tone of that, hey, we're here to work with you as an auditor. This is going to be a collegial engagement. So make sure you do that. The other thing is that when you're talking, you want to make sure that your voice is relaxed and in a lower register. So everyone has different placements of their voice tone. So it's really about a relative lower register. So for me, when I'm relaxed, I'm typically kind of talking in this type of register. I'm not anxious talking with all of you right now, presenting. This is kind of my relaxed tone. If I'm starting to get nervous, my register is going to go up a little higher and, my eyes might start getting wide and I might start talking a lot faster. So one of the things you can do is experiment before the audit meeting, experiment with the ranges in your voice and just you yourself hearing your voice in a lower register. Again, not saying my low register, but your lower register. You hearing yourself will actually calm yourself down. And it just shows that I don't have anything to hide. This meeting is going to be just fine. So the other thing is make sure that you're precise and succinct in your responses. The more that you talk, just like the more documentation you give, the more you risk inviting additional questions. Your lead representative may at times strategically elaborate on a specific process or policy. So sometimes when I'm trying to steer the conversation with an auditor in a particular direction, I may talk a bit more. I might not be as succinct, but it's a particular strategy. Your default should be precise, succinct. And then the other thing that's the most important thing, like this meeting with your auditor, if you have one, is not your only time to talk about things. So if you're not 100% confident about the words, the response that's about to come out of your mouth, just say, I'll get back to you, or I need to double check some items and I'll get back to you. Because in an audit, accuracy is so much better than speed. So that's hard for me because I imagine all sorts of stuff in my head. I can come up with an opinion about anything. And so I am someone who wants to answer the question. And so it is very hard even for me after all of these years in the audit space to just be like, even for something I'm like 90% sure it's true, just to say, I'll get back to you on that. Auditors are never surprised by that. So that really helps to calm and slow the pace of the conversation. Finally, at the end, make sure that you confirm action items. It's really helpful to actually ask the auditor to send you a follow-up email of what you want, because otherwise you can just sort of misremember what they asked you to do in the audit meeting. So that's something that's really helpful. Next slide, please. So then the closing audit process, right? So you're working on documentation, you may be having meetings with the auditor. You want to make sure that somebody in your group is tracking and following up on action items and that the responses need to be very well vetted before submission. I'm so sorry, this is supposed to say, this is my bad. They represent your university as a whole, not just ASU. I take very seriously anything that me or my team are formally responding to an auditor of, because we are saying this as official representatives, as an external audit liaison for ASU. So really vetting those answers and responses and making sure they're all coming through one team and one person. You don't want the PI to be having all these side audit conversations with the auditor at the same time that central and maybe even the department is having conversations. The other thing is you want to make consistent progress in responding to auditors' questions. So one of my awesome team members, Michelle Turner, talks about audits are a marathon and not a sprint. And so they sometimes take years to resolve, maybe because of delays on your end, maybe it's because of delays on the auditor side. So it's really important that you're engaged in the process, but don't be emotional because you're just going to waste a lot of emotion on it. And be sure to follow up with the auditor. If you haven't heard back in a reasonable amount of time, connecting with them and asking questions. And then always taking the opportunity through this process to consider lessons learned and be engaging in, process or policy change. Also through this process, you might identify documentation of, oh, this expense was unallowable. We should not be hiding stuff. We may be strategic in how we present different processes, but if you find something like this is unallowable on the project, you need to own it, but you need to talk through your strategy of how you disclose that to an auditor. So for us, when we find issues, we say, through our review, we found this issue and we've already removed the transaction, especially if it's an active award, or you're going to talk about often it's going to be like, we've reviewed and confirmed this is not a gap in internal controls. This was just an inadvertent human error. So you definitely want to be disclosing if you find issues, but meeting internally in advance to strategically talk about how do you put the university in the best light and how you handle those issues. Next slide, please. Okay, so you've received lots of information of things to think about internally as far as helping to reduce audit risk while you're working on transactions. And then we've talked about several strategies of how to be engaged and make it through successfully in an audit. So we want to open it up. We have 4.5 minutes left for questions. So either you can put questions in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. And then one of the final resources is we have a really great detailed audit readiness guide at ASU that's open to anyone who's on the call here. You can click on that and that will provide you lots of helpful descriptions that go into more detail about what we've talked about today.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Sam. Any questions? There's none in the chat. So everybody, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Or if you just want to throw it in the chat, I will ask it for you. And the link I provided wasn't the correct one, so I've since added a new one. So please take a look at that.
And I would say, for the sake of recording, if you're thinking of a specific example, be sure to be vague enough. Hypothetical questions are always welcome.
Give it another couple minutes or seconds for people to come up with their questions. But thank you, Sam, for the suggestions. You brought up several things that I just experienced this week with PIs trying to buy items that were probably not allocable. We're towards the end of the project. So those are really, really useful. And I know, speaking for a lot of RAs, that's definitely something that we see quite frequently, and having a strategy on how to get back to the PI with the right question to document that is extremely useful. Okay, well, if there's no questions, I just want to remind everybody to complete the survey. You will automatically, or you may automatically get the survey pop into your browser when you go to log out. You'll also get another survey regarding the whole conference. And thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sam and Sarah, for their time. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We had a great turnout.
Thanks,
everyone.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.